The Salt-Stained Hymnal. Chapter 10. The Salt-Stained Hymn. The groan of stressed metal was the first thing to claw its way back into his consciousness. A low, resonant ache that vibrated up from the floor, through the thin mattress, and into his bones. Joric's eyes snapped open to a greasy, blue-green darkness. For a disoriented second, he was back in the water, the weight of the ocean pressing in, the scream of collapsing architecture his only eulogy. He gasped, a raw, ragged sound, and the illusion shattered into the grim reality of his borrowed room. It wasn't a room so much as a repurposed nutrient vat, a coffin of rust-weeping steel tucked into the chaotic lattice of the Gill-Racks. Condensation traced silver paths down the curved walls, catching the sickly bioluminescence seeping through a grime-caked vent. Each drop gathered, swelled, and fell with a rhythmic plink into a bucket near his feet, a metronome for the city's decay. 1 beat, 2 beats, the drip cant of the desperate. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. A deep cellular exhaustion had taken root, the kind that felt less like fatigue and more like the beginning of a decomposition, a gift from the spore burst in Gamma 9. His head throbbed in time with the city's heartbeat, the distant, low-frequency hum of the reclamation pumps. The air was thick, a familiar cocktail of ozone from the overworked scrubbers, the wet dog smell of perpetually damp metal, and something else, something new and invasive, a sweet, cloying perfume, like honey left to ferment on a corpse, the scent of the murmuration, the scent of his failure. Pathogen, he muttered, his voice a dry rasp. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, the cold metal deck shocking his bare feet. Class 4 psychoactive mycotoxin, induces eidetic hallucinations. He recited the clinical diagnosis like an incantation, a ward against the memory bubbling just beneath the surface. It was a flimsy shield. His professional detachment, the armor he had spent a decade forging in the ashes of his faith, felt as thin as paper. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the afterimage was already burned onto the back of his eyelids. Not the monstrous bloomed, or the ecstatic vacant faces of the hymners. Something worse, something stolen from him. Leah. She had been standing in the darkest corner of the room, where the light didn't dare touch. Not a ghost, not a specter, but solid, real as the rust under his fingernails. She wore the yellow rain slicker he'd bought her, the one that was 2 sizes too big so she could grow into it. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead, not with sea salt, but with the omnipresent damp of benthos. She wasn't smiling. She never smiled in the memories. She just looked at him, her eyes wide with a question he could never answer. And she had held out her hand, a small, pale hand, beckoning him, deeper. Sod rot! Joric slammed his fist against the metal wall. The structure groaned back at him in sympathy, and a shower of rust flakes dusted his shoulder. The vision was gone, leaving only the cloying sweetness in the air and the frantic staccato of his own heart. He staggered to the small basin in the corner, splashing his face with recycled lukewarm water that smelt faintly of algae and chemicals. He stared at the man in the polished steel mirror above it, haggard, eyes bloodshot, nested in dark hollows of sleeplessness. The gray at his temple seemed more pronounced, a frost spreading from the cold core of his grief. This is what the murmuration does, he told himself. It doesn't just infect the body, it excavates the soul. It finds the deepest wound, the most profound loss, and it pries it open. It uses your own ghosts as its weapon. It was a brilliant, monstrously efficient delivery system for a lie. It promised reunion. It promised an end to pain. All you had to do was surrender. Let the whispering sickness become the hymn. Let the hymn dissolve you into the choir, a beautiful, painless end to the self. He had seen the reports from the BCA's psychoanalysis teams. The early-stage infected, the hymners, all described similar phenomena. Visions of lost loved ones, whispers of comfort in the dark, a profound sense of belonging. A spiritual experience, they called it, a divine communion. Joric knew better. It was just biology. A parasitic organism hijacking the host's neurology for its own propagation. It stimulated the brain's centers for memory and emotion, creating a feedback loop of profound, artificial comfort. It was a cage made of love. But knowing the mechanics of the lock didn't make the cage any less real. Seeing the blueprint for the ghost didn't stop it from haunting him.
It wasn't her. The words were a prayer to his own shattered nihilism. It was a neural impulse, a chemical reaction, a symptom. It was not his daughter reaching across the void of death and time. It was a fungus, a mindless network of mycelium puppeteering his grief. But the doubt was a poison of its own. What if he was wrong? The fear he so carefully suppressed, the fear that had driven him to debunk every prophet and shatter every new faith since the deluge, coiled in his gut. The terror of discovering a truth that was real, a truth that might mean his family's death and his survival had a purpose he had spat on for 82 years. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture heavy with a weariness that went beyond the physical. Kalen's orders were clear. Pull back, consolidate, let the enforcers establish a hard quarantine around Gamma-9. Treat it as a biological spill, cauterize the wound. But Kalen hadn't seen what Joric had seen. He hadn't felt it. You couldn't quarantine an idea. You couldn't shoot a promise of salvation. And you couldn't run from a ghost that lived inside your own blood. The vision had beckoned him, deeper. It was an invitation, or a challenge. The organism was learning, adapting. It had found his specific weakness. It was speaking directly to him now, using the face he most yearned to see. It was telling him the truth was not in the Ares' sterile labs or the BCA's redacted reports. The truth was down in the dark, in the water, at the source. The disorientation faded, replaced by something cold and hard. The grief, raw and debilitating only moments ago, began to crystallize. It was forging itself into a new tool inside him. Not acceptance, not faith, but a fanaticism of purpose, a scalpel of pure, intellectual vengeance. He would not be its convert. He would be its theologian, its vivisectionist. He turned from the basin, his movements now precise, economical. His gaze fell upon his gear, piled neatly on a crate, a waterproof data slate, a sampling kit,
a rebreather unit with its filters still sealed in sterile packaging. It was all surface-level equipment, pathetic, useless for where he needed to go. To go deeper, into the bloom deeps, he needed a guide, a sump diver, someone who knew the submerged ruins, the forgotten pathways, the places where the murmuration was not just a whisper, but a roar. Someone who could navigate the abyss. It would cost him every Cowley chit he had, and it would brand him a heretic in the eyes of the BCA, a willing sump-tainted. He picked up the data slate. The screen flickered to life, casting his face in a cool orange glow. A map of the Gill-Racks glimmered there, with the red bleed of the Gamma-9 quarantine zone pulsing like a wound. His fingers moved, tracing a path downward, past the last of the official districts into the black, uncharted territory of the deeps. He had to understand it. He had to tear it apart, piece by piece, until he found the biological mechanism that created her face. He would catalog it, codify it, and name it. He would reduce his daughter's ghost to an equation. Only then could he prove it wasn't her. Only then could he be free. The dripping in the corner continued its steady, indifferent rhythm. 1 beat, 2 beats. He wasn't running from the whisper anymore. He was going to find the mouth it came from. The only sound in Commander Kalen Rask's command center was the whisper-thin hum of the Ares life support. It was a sound he had cultivated, the acoustic signature of absolute control. Here, 82 years of decay were held at bay by polymer, sterilized air, and unwavering protocol. The vast pre-deluge glass of the viewport was not a window, but a display, filtering the perpetual twilight of Benthos into a clean, data-rich schematic of the city below. Sprawling orange lines denoted power conduits. Pulsing blue represented the flow of reclaimed water through the city's arteries. A cancerous, sickly green bloom, labeled Sector Gamma-9, pulsed erratically, growing with every cycle of the city's heartbeat. It was a statistical problem, a system imbalance, nothing more. Kalen's gloved fingers traced the edge of the spreading green without touching the cool glass of the central console. His face, reflected faintly in the dark screen, was a mask of placid analysis. No alarm, no frustration. Those were luxuries, inefficient variables that led to structural failure. He was the chief engineer of humanity's last viable habitat, and emotion was the most dangerous form of rust. A soft chime, calibrated to be informative rather than intrusive, announced an arrival. A pneumatic door hissed open, admitting a junior officer, Ensign Valerius. The man stood ramrod straight just inside the threshold, his crisp gray uniform a shade darker where the Ares filtered humidity had clung to it. He held a data slate clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "Commander," Valerius said, his voice tight, "the asset's scheduled check-in is now 97 minutes overdue." Kalen didn't turn. His attention remained on the spreading digital infection below. "The asset," he corrected, his tone as sterile as the air, "has a designation. Forensic Theologian Contour. Use it." "Yes, Commander. My apologies. Theologian Contour has failed to respond to automated queries. His last transponder signal was logged at coordinates 7GAMMA 9PYLON 113, within the Gill-Racks, adjacent to the cistern overflow." Kalen finally turned, his movement economical. He held out a hand, and Valerius stepped forward quickly, placing the slate in his palm. The ensign retreated a respectful 3 paces. Kalen's eyes scanned the data. Joric's vitals, up until the point they'd cut out. Heart rate elevated. Respiration erratic. A spike in local atmospheric spore counts, orders of magnitude above the accepted threshold. Then nothing. He swiped a finger, bringing up a situational report from the same sector. It was flagged with high-priority warnings: mass civil disturbance, unsanctioned religious gathering, and a single chilling field note from a BCA patrol that had wisely kept its distance. Anomalous purification of cistern Gamma 9 Charlie. Mycelial structures observed acting as biological filters. Mass conversion event in progress. Kalen read the lines again, not with shock, but with the cold satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. He had known Joric contour was a risk, a necessary one, but a risk nonetheless. The man's file was a litany of psychological instabilities, all stemming from a single, predictable emotional wound. A survivor, the sole specimen of a failed family unit. Such individuals were often useful. Their nihilism made them efficient debunkers, but they lacked systemic loyalty. Their core programming was compromised by loss. They were, in essence, cracked vessels. And now this particular vessel had been submerged. Kalen placed the slate on the console with a soft click. "His disobedience is not an act of will, Ensign," he stated, the words perfectly modulated. "It is a symptom. The asset's operational parameters have been corrupted by pathogenic influence. He ceased being Theologian Cantor 98 minutes ago." "Commander?" Valerius asked, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "You mean he's infected?" "I mean he is no longer our asset," Kalen clarified, his gaze sharp and pinning the younger man in place. "He is an agent of the opposing system, a mobile vector of contagion with intimate knowledge of BCA security protocols. His analysis was the mission. Now his mind itself is a weapon pointed back at us." The emotional shift in the room was palpable, though it emanated entirely from Valerius. The air grew colder. Kalen's own state remained unchanged. He had identified the problem, now he would apply the solution. It was simple, it was protocol. He turned back to the main console, his fingers flying across its surface. A new set of authorization windows appeared, layered in crimson security clearance codes. He bypassed them with practiced ease. "This isn't a recovery mission, Ensign. Do you understand that?" "Sir, Cantor is one of our best. He's closed down 17 cults. If there's a chance—" "Hope is not a variable in this equation." Kalen's voice cut through the ensign's plea like a scalpel. "Hope is the initial spore. It finds a crack in the system and begins to grow. It promises warmth in the cold, a song in the silence, and then it consumes, rotting the structure from within. We are not a structure of hope, Valerius. We are a structure of function, and this component is malfunctioning." Kalen's finger hovered over the final confirmation icon. He looked at the expanding green stain on the map of his city, and then at the single blinking red dot that was Joric's last known position. One was a disease, the other was its newest symptom. "Theologian Cantor is now classified as an unchecked asset, hostile, contagious."
He tapped the icon. The command was sent.
"Authorize Strike Team Epsilon," he said, his voice a dead-flat monotone that seemed to suck the very warmth from the room. "Primary mandate, track and contain. Secondary mandate." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "If containment proves unviable, or if the asset resists, the mandate shifts to immediate neutralization, with extreme prejudice. I want no part of him brought back. I want his signal erased from the network." Ensign Valerius swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive quiet. "Yes, Commander. Understood." "See to it personally. And Ensign," Kalen added, turning his head just enough to fix the man with a chillingly empty stare, "update the risk assessment model. Factor in a 35% probability that Contour will actively attempt to spread his infection. Treat him not as a man, but as a biological weapon." Dismissed. As the pneumatic door hissed shut behind the shaken officer, Kalen Rask turned back to the viewport. His reflection stared back, impassive. He had excised the faulty component. He had followed the protocol. He felt nothing. No regret, no triumph. Just the quiet, clean hum of a system, momentarily stabilized, ready for the next inevitable failure. The directions had been a sequence of whispers and chits passed through the Gill-Racks black market, a trail of breadcrumbs leading not to a door, but to a maintenance hatch slick with algae. Joric pried it open, the screech of rusted metal a violation in the relative quiet of the sub-level catwalk. Below, the city's heartbeat was a physical presence, a low thrumming vibration that resonated in his teeth. The air that washed over him was thick, a trinity of smells, the ozone of arcing scavenged tech, the metallic tang of corrosion, and something else, something sweeter, like honeyed soil and decay, the scent of the bloom deeps.
He descended a dripping ladder into the cavernous space of a repurposed pump station. The primary impeller was long dead, a massive fossilized nautilus of rust dominating the chamber. Emergency lighting cast a sickly orange pall over everything, supplemented by the greasy blue-green glow of bioluminescent fungi cultivated in cracked bell jars. The place was a hoarder's nest, a testament to a life lived on the edge of the abyss. Spools of pressure-sheathed cable lay in coiled pythons. The carcasses of salvaged filtration units were splayed open, their mechanical guts spilling across workbenches. And everywhere there was diving gear, rebreathers in various states of repair, reinforced dive suits hanging like flayed skins from meat hooks, and rows of vicious-looking tools designed for prying, cutting, and killing. In the center of the chaos, a figure was hunched over a workbench, her back to him. A plasma cutter hissed, spitting a shower of brilliant white sparks that momentarily bleached the color from the room. She wore a stained and patched pressure vest over a threadbare shirt, her muscles taut and corded. She didn't turn. Joric cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the chamber's acoustics. "I'm looking for Moro Cade." The hissing stopped. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the metronomic drip of condensation from a high pipe. The figure slowly straightened, placing the cutter on the bench with a deliberate clank. When she turned, her face was a map of hard-won survival. A lattice of faint scars webbed one side of her jaw, her eyes dark and quick, missing nothing. She wiped a grease-stained hand on her trousers and picked up a rag. "Depends who's asking," she said, her voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. She began cleaning a rebreather's valve, her movements economical and precise. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe. His relatively clean clothes, the airy cut of his jacket, the way he stood as if expecting the ground beneath him to be stable. "My name is Joric Contour." He held up his wrist interface, activating the BCA credentials. A sterile blue hologram projected into the damp air. "I'm a forensic theologian, contracted by the Consolidation Authority."
Morrow looked at the shimmering emblem, then back at him. A corner of her mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. Salt rot. A spook, and a fancy one at that. The BCA doesn't come down this far unless something's truly broken. She tossed the rag aside. Or they're looking to break something themselves. "I need a guide," Joric said, letting the credential fade. The professional mask felt brittle, threatening to crack. Behind his eyes, an afterimage of his daughter's face flickered. Not the faded photograph he kept, but the one from the spore burst. Vivid, accusatory, real. Into the submerged levels of Gamma 9. This time she did laugh. It was a short, sharp, humorless sound. "Gamma 9? You mean the choir loft? No, absolutely not." She turned back to her workbench. "Find some other sump rat with a death wish. I'm busy." Joric's desperation clawed at his throat. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on loose debris. "I was told you were the best, that you'd been deeper than anyone." "Being the best means knowing which jobs are just a fancy way to die," she retorted without looking at him. "You airy types think the deeps are just a structural problem, flooded basements with some glowing moss. You have no idea." She picked up a heavy, wicked-looking spear gun, checking its pneumatic seals. "It's not the pressure that gets you. It's not the collapses or the things that swim in the dark. It's the sound, the song." "The murmuration," Joric supplied, his voice tight. "I know what it is. It's a biological agent, a fungal hallucinogen. That's why I have to get to the source." She finally faced him again, her expression a mix of pity and contempt. "You know what it is? You've read a data slate about it in a clean room, maybe? I've seen what it does. I've hauled up divers who clawed their own eyes out because they saw God in a bubble of swamp gas. I've seen hymners walk into the water with smiles on their faces, singing to their own drowning."
"This isn't just about them anymore," Joric confessed, the words slipping out, raw and unplanned. The clinical detachment he'd spent a lifetime cultivating was gone, dissolved by a single potent hallucination. His mission was no longer about proving the universe was empty. It was about clawing that beautiful, lying image of his daughter out of his own skull. "I'll double your standard rate." "My standard rate for a trip to the choir loft is no," Morrow said flatly. "Calibrated leaders don't do me any good when my brain is being scooped out and replaced with mycelium. Your digital money is worthless where you want to go." Frustration boiled in Joric's gut. He was used to transactions, to logic, to a world where needs and costs could be quantified. This was something else. This was a refusal based on a deep primal wisdom he couldn't counter with reason. He had nothing left but pure, unvarnished need. "Then name your price," he said, his voice dropping. "Not in cows, in whatever you want. Anything." For the first time, Morrow seemed to pause. She studied him, her gaze sharp, analytical. She saw past the BCA contractor to the haunted man beneath. She saw the desperation he was failing to hide. It was a currency she understood far better than water credits. She walked over to a rusted locker and pulled out a small, heavily insulated container. With a hiss of depressurization, she opened it. Inside, nestled in cooling gel, was a single, auto-injecting syringe. The liquid within was pearlescent. "Purity," she said, her voice low. That's the only coin that matters down here. She pointed a grimy finger at the syringe. This is my last dose, a full-spectrum immunobooster. Airy grade, not the diluted trash they sell in the rackside clinics. It keeps the rot out, the little things, the things in the water and the air that get into your blood and turn you inside out long before the whispering sickness ever finds you. Joric stared at the injector. He knew exactly what it was. A single dose cost more than his entire apartment's lease cycle. It was the sterile, hoarded lifeblood of the elite. She closed the container with a soft click. My price is one full cycle's supply, 12 doses, delivered up front.
Joric felt the air leave his lungs. It was an impossible price. It wasn't just expensive, it was unobtainable. Acquiring that much would require more than just his savings. It would mean theft. It would mean burning every bridge he had with the BCA, becoming a criminal in the eyes of the only power structure that mattered. That's, he began, the word insane dying on his lips. Morrow shrugged, her face unreadable. That's the price to watch you commit suicide. I won't do it for less. She walked back to her bench, picked up her tools, and prepared to get back to work, the negotiation seemingly over. The hum of the pump station filled the silence, the heartbeat of a city that didn't care if he lived or died. But in his mind he heard a different sound, a little girl's laughter twisted into a fungal hymn. He saw her face beckoning him into the dark. He had no choice at all. "All right," Joric heard himself say, the word tasting of rust and ruin. "I'll get them." The workshop was a shrine to salvaged things. Morrow Cade's domain smelled of ozone, hot metal, and the damp, earthy breath of the Gill-Racks that seeped through every corroded seam. A single orange work lamp sputtered on a bench, casting long, dancing shadows that made the heaps of scavenged tech look like the bones of sleeping leviathans. Water dripped from a bundle of overhead conduits, a frantic, irregular rhythm against the city's steady, bass-thrumming heartbeat. It was a sound that grated on Joric's nerves, each drop a countdown. He stood stiffly near the entrance, his airy tailored jacket feeling absurdly out of place in this world of rust and function. "I have the cows," Joric said, his voice tight. "A direct transfer. The full amount plus a 20% hazard bonus. It's more than fair for a guide." Morrow didn't look up from the plasma welder she was servicing. The tool's casing was scarred and pitted, its power cell linked by a frayed cable to a humming capacitor bank that looked ready to arc. She was a compact silhouette of lean muscle and grease-stained coveralls, her movements economical and precise. She finished tightening a seal before setting the welder down with a solid metallic clank.
"Cows are a promise, Cantor," she said, her voice a low rasp. She finally turned, wiping her hands on an already blackened rag. Her eyes, pale in the orange gloom, assessed him with the detached interest of a predator sizing up strange prey. A promise that the water will keep flowing from the kidney, a promise that the BCA will hold. Promises get broken down here. She moved to the workbench, her boots scuffing on the grated floor. With a swipe of her hand, she activated a flickering data slate. A schematic of Benthos shimmered into life, a ghostly blue cross-section of the city's tiered structure. The Eyrie was a clean, sharp crown, the Gill-Racks a chaotic web, and below them the Bloom Deeps, a dark, jagged ruin. "I need a down payment," she said, her grimy finger tapping the screen. The image zoomed, descending through layers of decay, the lines becoming less certain, more fractured. It settled on a blocky structure deep in the submerged levels, flagged with a faded red BCA warning sigil. Something real. Joric leaned closer, the slate's cold light illuminating the strain on his face. "What is that?" "BCA Infirmary Gamma 7, Morrow stated, her tone flat, devoid of any hint of the danger she was describing. "Decommissioned 50 years back, when pump station Epsilon failed. It's been stewing in the dark ever since, fully submerged." Her finger traced a path from an old service duct down into the structure, highlighting a room labeled Diagnostics. "The old world built things to last. There's a somatic resonance scanner in there, a Model 7, intact according to the last diver who got close enough to ping it before something pulled him under." A cold dread, heavier than the waterlogged air, began to pool in Joric's stomach. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an indictment. He was a man of words, of data, of sterile labs and academic theory. She was asking him to descend into the physical manifestation of everything he studied from a safe distance. That's deep in the bloom deeps," he managed, his own voice sounding hollow. "The spore concentrations there would be off the charts. It's not just a hot zone, it's a genesis pool."
"That's why the scanner is still there," she countered, a flicker of something, amusement, contempt in her eyes. She switched off the slate, plunging them back into the intimate orange glow. "You want a guide who can get you to your profit? Fine. You go. You retrieve the scanner. You bring it back to me. That's the buy-in." Joric's mind reeled, his professional detachment shattering against the brutal reality of her proposal. Alone. The word echoed in the sudden silence, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of the leaking conduit. Alone in the crushing dark, with nothing but a thin layer of metal and glass separating him from the toxic, living sea. The pressure, the groaning of a dying superstructure, and the whispers. His hand instinctively went to his temple, where the ghost of a headache still lingered from the spore burst in the Gill-Racks. He could still see his daughter's face, Anya, not as a faded memory, but as a vivid, breathing thing, her eyes wide with a question he couldn't answer. The thought of being in that lightless infirmary, trapped and alone when she appeared again. The terror was a physical thing, a cold hand closing around his throat. But what was the alternative? Return to Kalen, tail between his legs, to be quarantined and dissected for his exposure? Give up? Let the murmuration take root in his mind without understanding what it was, what it wanted from him? Let the memory of his daughter be twisted into a tool by a god he refused to believe in? No. His nihilism was a fortress built on the bedrock of his family's graves. He would not let a fungus desecrate their memory. He had to know the truth of it, even if it meant drowning in the dark to find it. "Alone?" he asked, the single word a surrender. Morrow nodded, her expression unreadable. She leaned against the workbench, crossing her arms. "I'm not risking my rig or my neck on an airy pure who might go salt rot at the first pressure groan. I need to know you can hold it together when you feel the city breathing around you. I need to know you can handle the whispers in the static without opening your helmet for a better listen." Her gaze was unflinching. It was a test, yes, but it was more than that. It was the price of entry into her world. He had to prove he was more than a client. He had to prove he was a survivor. Slowly, deliberately, Joric nodded. The gesture felt monumental, a final step off a cliff he hadn't realized he was standing on.
The dread didn't lessen, it solidified, becoming a cold, hard certainty in his gut. This was happening. For a long moment, Morrow just watched him. Then, with a grunt that might have been approval, she pushed herself off the bench. She rummaged under a tarp, the sound of clanking metal echoing in the small space. She emerged and slid a heavy, scarred rebreather unit across the workbench. It screeched against the metal surface. Beside it, she placed a handheld hydro cutter, its power cell showing only a half charge. "A down payment for your down payment," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The rebreather's filter is clean. The cutter might get you through one interior door before it dies. Don't waste it." She looked him dead in the eye. "And Cantor, stay dry." The tactical briefing room in Airy Command was a tomb of white polymer and pre-deluge glass. It was designed to be sterile, silent, a place where logic could be forged into action, free from the city's endless damp and decay. But the tomb had been breached. The air, once sharp with the ozone tang of perfectly calibrated scrubbers, now carried a faint, sweetish undertone, the smell of honey and rot, the smell of failure. Commander Kalen Rask stood before the obsidian hollow table, his posture as rigid as the dying city's spine. Through the viewport behind him, Benthos was a corpse. The perpetual twilight under the smog was now lit by the sickly pulsing greens and blues of the bloom deeps, a light that had crept relentlessly upward. The Gill-Racks were gone, swallowed by a luminescent tide. He had watched the district's life signs wink out on the master grid, one hab unit at a time, a cascade of silent electronic deaths. His city, his system, dissolving. Before him stood the last of his authority, the Purity Unit. 6 figures clad in matte white, vacuum-sealed tactical armor. Their helmets were smooth, faceless ovals of polarized plasteel, reflecting his own stern image back at him a dozen times. They were his final protocols made flesh, extensions of a will that now operated on the single remaining directive of structured survivalism. When a system is terminally infected, you sterilize it.
With a flick of his wrist, the hollow table shimmered to life. A 3-dimensional schematic of the city's foundation spun in the air, a web of decaying rebar and concrete chasms. A single, angry red pulse throbbed deep within its core. The source. Kalen's voice was flat, a calibrated instrument that betrayed none of the cold fury churning within him. Seismic and bioresonance readings confirm it, the primary nexus of the murmuration. The 6 helmets tilted in unison. No questions. Never any questions. That was their strength. He swiped a hand through the air. The schematic vanished, replaced by a grainy surveillance still. A child. A girl with wide, dark eyes and a face smudged with grime. Ilara. "This is Asset Epsilon, primary objective." His internal monologue was a different voice, a raw, grating sound he kept locked behind his teeth. A variable, an anomaly. The last hope for a biological countermeasure. A key. But to his unit, she was an asset, a thing to be acquired. "The asset displays complete immunity to all known spore strains of the murmuration pathogen," he continued, his tone clinical. "Her biology may contain the necessary antigens to synthesize a city-wide fungicide. Aqua Veritas's preliminary models were optimistic before their communications went dark." He didn't mention Lena Sobel,
or the fact that the kidney, the heart of Benthos, was now pumping the city's own poison through its veins. Such details were unnecessary variables. They bred doubt. Your orders are to secure this asset, unharmed. She is to be brought to the surface extraction point for immediate analysis. Understood? Understood, Commander. The reply was a single synthesized voice, spoken by all six in perfect sync. Kalen's jaw tightened. He swiped the air again. The child's face dissolved, replaced by a familiar one. Joric Cantor. The official BCA photographic file showed a man with intelligent, haunted eyes, a hint of academic arrogance in his expression. Kalen had chosen him for that arrogance, believing it would be a shield against the very faith he was sent to debunk. Another failure. Another miscalculation in a system that was supposed to have none. A red, strobing biohazard symbol stamped itself over Cantor's face. The word sump-tainted appeared in block letters below it. "This is the vector," Kalen said, and this time the coldness in his voice had an edge, a razor's edge. "Forensic theologian Joric Cantor. He was our primary investigator. He is now compromised." He let that hang in the sterile air for a moment. Compromised. Such a clean word for what he's become. A traitor to reason. A sporehead whispering to the ghosts in his own skull. Kalen remembered their final conversation. Joric's desperate, unhinged talk of sentience, of consciousness. The ravings of the whispering sickness. Intel suggests the vector has taken possession of Asset Epsilon. He believes she is something other than a biological key, a prophet, a symbol. The semantics are irrelevant. His judgment is impaired. He represents a catastrophic threat to the mission's integrity. Kalen paced once before the table, his boots making no sound on the deck plating. He stopped and faced his unit, his reflection staring back from their impassive masks. Secondary objective, apprehend the vector. He is to be contained for debriefing and pathogen analysis. He let his gaze drift from one helmet to the next. He saw the faint orange of the emergency lighting glinting on their polished surfaces. He could feel the pressure of their attention, their absolute readiness to obey. However, his time in the Bloom Deeps, combined with his known psychological vulnerabilities, make him unpredictable. He has defied direct orders. He has consorted with sump-tainted elements. He has abandoned logic for belief. He almost spat the word. If his apprehension proves inefficient, Kalen chose the word with surgical precision, if he resists, or if he poses an immediate and direct contamination risk to any member of this unit or to the asset, lethal force is pre-authorized. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the tons of toxic water pressing down on the city. The professional briefing was over. The menacing intent had been delivered. He wasn't sending a recovery team. He was sending executioners with a conditional warrant. His knowledge of BCA protocols makes him dangerous. His infection makes him a liability. Do not hesitate. The survival of this city, what is left of it, outweighs the life of one compromised analyst. There is no room for error. There is no room for sentiment.
His own words echoed in his mind. System integrity over individual components. It was the first lesson of structured survivalism. It was all he had left. Another synthesized, unified, understood commander cut through the quiet. Kalen gestured to the hollow table. The schematics reappeared, but now a second icon pulsed beside the red throb of the murmuration's core. It was a small, elegant diagram of a thermobaric charge, the final protocol. Should you fail to retrieve the asset, should the vector succeed in delivering her to the fungal nexus, you are to proceed to these coordinates and deploy this device. Sterilization will be our final guarantee. He was giving them permission to burn the foundation out from under the city, to kill the god and its cradle and anyone left inside it, an act of pure logical despair. That is all. Gear up. Descent in 5 minutes. The purity unit turned as one and marched from the room, their movements economical and silent. The door hissed shut behind them, leaving Kalen alone with the smell of rot and the ghost of Joric Cantor staring at him from the display. He walked to the viewport and placed a hand on the cold, vibrating glass. He looked down at the beautiful, cancerous glow that had consumed his world. The murmuration hadn't defeated him with monsters or soldiers. It had defeated him with a promise, with hope, a pathogen more virulent than any spore. He had one last move, one last protocol, an act of total, uncompromising negation. Stay dry, Cantor. The thing Morrow shoved into his hands was heavier than it had any right to be. A sump diver's rebreather, its casing scarred with a spiderweb of fracture lines, sealed in greasy off-white epoxy. A thick rubber hose, cracked like old skin, snaked from a regulator that looked like it had been salvaged from a museum. The whole apparatus smelled of ozone, stagnant water, and the faint coppery tang of old fear. Joric's fingers traced the rough-patched seals. In his lab in the Airy, his equipment was sterile, calibrated, its functions displayed on clean, bright readouts. This was an organ harvested from a dead machine, an artifact of desperation.
Morrow's workshop was a cramped alcove carved out of weeping concrete, perched on the precipice of an access pool that descended into absolute blackness. The air was a physical weight, thick with the sweet fungal scent of the bloom deeps, a smell like honey and rot that coated the back of his throat. The only light came from a single sputtering orange emergency strip overhead, casting their shadows long and distorted against walls slick with a film of sickly green bioluminescence. Below, the deep, metronomic hum of the city's heartbeat pumps resonated up through the soles of his boots. "You ever been under pressure, theologian?" Morrow's voice was flat, scraping the air like rust on steel. She didn't wait for an answer, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she checked the seals on her own slightly less battered gear. "I've studied the physiological effects," Joric began, his own voice sounding hollow and academic in the human space. "Hypoxia, hypercapnia, high-pressure nervous syndrome?" Morrow stopped, fixing him with a look that stripped away his titles and left him feeling like a child. "Salt rot. I'm not talking about your data slates. I'm talking about the weight of 100 meters of dead city trying to crush the air from your lungs." She tapped a tarnished brass gauge on the rebreather he was holding. "This sticks. Don't trust it. Trust the burn in your chest. The scrubber mix is good for 6 hours. 5 if you start breathing hard. 4 if you panic." She leaned in closer, her face half lit by the orange glare. "And you will panic." Joric swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive quiet. He strapped the rebreather on, the cold weight settling on his back, a promise of the abyss. Morrow handed him a headlamp next. The lannis was clouded. The beam it cast a watery, flickering cone. "Row 1, she said, her voice dropping lower. "We move silent. The big things down there hunt by sound. vibrations in the water. Keep your movements slow, deliberate, no sudden moves. Joric nodded, his throat too tight for words. The familiar, sterile world of theory was evaporating, replaced by a set of brutal, unforgiving axioms for survival. Rule 2. The rapture. He knew the term, nitrogen narcosis. He'd read the pre-deluge manuals, the autopsy reports of divers who died smiling, their lungs full of water.
It's not like the books say, Morrow continued, as if reading his thoughts. It doesn't just make you drunk. It makes you accepting. The pressure feels like a blanket. The cold feels warm. Down in the dark, you'll start to see lights. Beautiful lights. And you'll think the most logical thing in the world is to take off your mask to breathe them in. She tapped her own temple. It gets in your head. But the spores, salt rot, the spores make it worse. His blood went cold. He thought of his daughter's face, a perfect, luminous phantom conjured by the spores in the Gill-Racks. Her voice, a whisper of comfort and impossible promises. That was here, in a controlled environment. What would she be like down there, in the very heart of the murmuration's power, amplified by pressure and darkness? The concentration is 1,000 times what it is up here, Morrow said, her eyes fixed on the black water of the access pool. It's not just a whisper down there, it's a hymn. It gets into the rebreather's mix, seeps through the seals. It doesn't just show you things, it tells you things. It will tell you I am an enemy. It will tell you the way back up is death, and the only salvation is to go deeper. It will use your own mind to drown you. You fight it, you hear me? Whatever you see, whatever you hear, it's the fungus, it's the rot, it's not real. But it felt real. The memory of his daughter's hand, so vivid he'd almost felt its warmth. That was the disease? The thought was a hook in his gut. His mission was to prove this faith was a pathogen. Yet the pathogen offered him the one thing his sterile, meaningless world never could: comfort, reunion. And the last rule, Morrow said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Die bloomed. She didn't need to explain. He had seen the BCA pictograms, the censored footage. Some tainted who had been fully consumed, their bodies repurposed by the fungal network. They don't swim, she said, her gaze distant, haunted. They just drift, like forgotten prayers. Their skin is covered in pulsing blue and green nodes. The eyes, they hang in the water, perfectly still, sometimes for days. They look peaceful. She finally looked back at him, her eyes boring into his own. They are not. Don't touch them. Don't get near them. And whatever you do, do not look directly into the eyes. It's like looking into the sun. It'll burn out your thoughts. You'll just stop. You'll stop swimming, stop breathing. You'll just float there with them until the fungus takes you too. The academic detachment Joric had worn for years like armor plating was gone. It hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated. In its place was a raw primal fear, cold and sharp. He was a theologian about to step into hell, armed with faulty equipment and the warnings of a woman who spoke of it like a familiar neighbor. Every danger she described was a perfect synthesis of the physical and the psychological, a targeted assault on the body and the soul. Morrow finished her checks and slung a coil of rope over her shoulder, along with a wicked-looking pressure harpoon. She gave him a final dismissive once-over. You're a liability, Cantor. You know that, right? You're slow, you're soft,
And your head's already full of ghosts." She flicked on her own headlamp, a beam of clean, white light that cut a sharp line through the gloom. It made the flickering orange of Joric's lamp seem pathetic. "Follow my light," she commanded. "Don't think, just follow. You get distracted, you fall behind, you're just more food for the bloom. Understood?" Joric could only manage a stiff nod, the weight on his back suddenly feeling like a tombstone. Good. Moro turned without another word and stepped to the edge of the pool. For a moment she was a silhouette against the dark, oily surface of the water. Then, with barely a splash, she was gone. Her light dwindled, a shrinking star in an infinite void. He was alone. The only sounds were the constant metronomic drip of condensation from the ceiling, the groan of the city around him, and the frantic hammering pulse in his own ears. He looked down at the rebreather's hose in his hand, then back at the black, waiting water. Apprehension had curdled into a thick, suffocating dread. Every part of his rational mind screamed at him to turn back, to return to the relative safety of the Gill-Racks. But the ghost of his daughter was already waiting for him down there. He knew it. And that was a pull stronger than any fear. He switched on his flickering lamp, took a last breath of thick fungal air, and stepped off the edge. The maintenance shaft yawned at Joric's feet, a perfect circle of blackness cut into the corroded deck plate. It was less a hole and more a wound in the city's flesh, exhaling the sweet, cloying breath of the bloom deeps, honey and rot, life and death entwined in a single scent. Above, the perpetual orange twilight of emergency lighting fought a losing battle with the greasy smog, casting long skeletal shadows. The city's heartbeat, the low-frequency thrum of the reclamation pumps, was a constant, oppressive presence, a rhythm he'd learned to ignore, but now felt in the bones of his teeth. He knelt, running a gloved hand over the pitted rim of the shaft. Cold, damp steel slick with algae. Below, the water was a mirror of liquid obsidian, disturbed only by the metronomic drip, drip, drip of condensation from a weeping conduit overhead, a sound for every second of a life spent waiting for the fall. Stay dry, the benthos blessing, a bitter joke down here. Double-checking the seals on his rebreather mask, Joric pulled it over his head. The world snapped into a claustrophobic frame of scratched plasteel. The ozone tang of the failing air scrubbers vanished, replaced by the sterile metallic taste of recycled oxygen. He could hear his own pulse now, a frantic counter-rhythm to the city's groan. This was the part he hated, the transition, the surrender, leaving one hostile environment for another, infinitely more alien. He sat on the edge, swung his legs over, and without allowing a moment of doubt to fester, he slipped into the water.
The cold was a physical blow, a vicious, biting shock that stole the air from his lungs. It flooded his thin thermal suit, clinging to his skin like a shroud. For a horrifying second, it was the deluge all over again, the glacial surge of the Atlantic claiming his home, his family. He clenched his jaw, forcing the memory down. It was just water. Contaminated, toxic, but just water. The city's hum vanished. The constant drip was gone. All sound ceased, erased by the immense pressure. The only thing left was the sound of himself, a dry rasping in, a bubbling hiss out. The intimate, mechanical rhythm of his own survival. Inhale, exhale, the first and last hymn. He activated his helmet lamp. A cone of stark white light cut through the abyssal gloom, illuminating a universe of swirling particulates. Silt,
rust flakes, and shimmering, almost beautiful clouds of spores danced in the beam like dust in a forgotten cathedral. The shaft descended into crushing infinity. Rusted ladder rungs, slick with black slime, lined one wall, disappearing into the depths. Bloated conduits and thick bundles of cabling snaked along the other, draped in pale, gently pulsing curtains of mycelium that gave off a sickly green-blue glow. Down. The only way was down. He began to pull himself along the ladder, hand over hand, his movements slow and deliberate. Each rung was a small victory against the water's deadening grip. The pressure built steadily, a heavy hand pressing on his chest, a dull ache behind his eyes. He swallowed, trying to equalize, the click in his ears unnaturally loud in the silence. 10 meters. 15. The surface was a distant memory, a shimmering ceiling of orange light that grew dimmer with every foot he descended. Debris hung suspended in the water column, a twisted sheet of plasteel, a child's boot trailing a long strand of algae like a lost soul, a waterlogged data slate, its screen dark and dead. Relics of the drowned world. Ghosts in the machine. He navigated around them, his focus narrowing to the next rung, the next breath. The simple mechanical process was a shield against the vast, crushing emptiness that surrounded him. But the spores were already in his blood, a quiet poison waiting for the right conditions to bloom. And there were no better conditions than absolute silence, sensory deprivation, and the weight of an ocean on his soul.
It began subtly, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. He stopped, holding his breath, the rebreather's hiss falling silent. He scanned the darkness beyond his lamp's beam. Nothing, just the slow, silent waltz of the debris. Probably a mutated eel or a scuttler crab disturbed by his passage. He continued his descent. Another flicker, this time closer. He held his light steady, piercing the gloom. The beam caught on a tangle of severed cables, dangling from the wall like metallic entrails. It must have been the current, a slight shift in the water causing them to sway. It had to be. Logic, observation, conclusion, the creed of the debunker. But the part of him that was not a theologian, the part that was a father, knew better. And then he saw her. She materialized out of the black, not swinning, but simply appearing. Floating 20 feet below him, just at the edge of his light, as if she were made of the darkness itself. Leah! His heart seized, the rasp of the rebreather hitched, a dry, ragged sound. It was impossible, a trick of the light, a symptom of nitrogen narcosis. "The spores!" he screamed internally. "It's the goddamn spores, you fool! It's the pathogen doing what it does!" But she was so real. Her face, pale and serene, was exactly as he remembered it from that last morning. The small upturned nose he used to tap with his finger. The scattering of freckles that were just starting to fade as she approached adolescence. Her dark hair didn't float wildly as it should have in the water. Instead, it framed her face in a perfect, impossible halo. She was wearing the blue jumper she loved, the one with the stitched-on rocket ship. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes, wide and unnervingly clear in the murky water, were fixed on something far below, something in the crushing blackness he couldn't see. There was no fear on her face, no pain, only a placid, unnerving calm, a follower's calm. "Leah!" The name was a choked gasp, a cloud of frantic bubbles erupting from his regulator. The sound was swallowed instantly by the water, a prayer offered to a dead god. He let go of the ladder, his body suddenly weightless, desperate. He pushed off the wall, kicking, trying to reach her. His lamp beam swung wildly, painting chaotic strokes of white across the shaft. For a moment the light left her, and when it swung back, she was gone. Vanished.
There was nothing. Just the empty, debris-filled water, the swaying cables, the silent, glowing fungus on the walls. The illusion shattered, leaving behind a void colder and more terrifying than the water itself. Joric floated in the immense silence, his limbs heavy, his breathing now a panicked, desperate roar in his own ears. Inhale, hiss, exhale, bubble. Inhale, hiss, exhale, bubble. He fumbled for the ladder, his gloved fingers finding the slick, cold metal. He clung to it, his knuckles white, anchoring himself against the dizzying vertigo of his own compromised mind. He had seen it. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a dream. It was a projection. The murmuration was in his head, digging through the wreckage of his past, weaponizing his grief, using the face of his dead daughter to speak to him in a language beyond words. The professional clinical detachment he had cultivated for years was a lie, a thin crust of ice on a deep, turbulent ocean of pain. And the murmuration had just punched through it. He was no longer an observer. He was a subject, the specimen under the slide, and he was utterly, terrifyingly alone in the dark. The magnetic lock disengaged with a thick, syrupy groan, the sound of metal surrendering to a decade of rust and pressure. Joric put his shoulder to the heavy door and heaved. It scraped open just wide enough for him to slip through, the noise grating against the oppressive quiet of the submerged corridor. He sealed it behind him, the finality of the sound echoing in the water and in the small bones of his ears. He was in the main ward of the Gamma 9B-CA infirmary. His headlamp cut a cone of clean white light through the murky water, illuminating a scene of impossible, ghastly stillness. It wasn't a room. It was a ballroom for the dead. Dozens of standard-issue medical beds floated in a silent, orderly grid, each one tethered to the floor by mooring cables that swayed in the gentle currents his entry had created. They were empty, their sterile white sheets rippling like spectral shrouds. Beside them, IV stands rose like skeletal metallic trees, their empty hooks waiting for bags of saline that would never come. Monitors and diagnostic carts stood silent vigil, their screens dark and lifeless, filmed over with a greasy layer of algae.
Every surface was coated in a fine silt that drifted with the slightest movement. The air in his rebreather tasted stale, recycled one too many times. He could smell it even through the filters, the faint, lingering ghost of antiseptic fighting a losing war against the sweet, cloying scent of rot that seeped through the infirmary's failing seals. The smell of the murmuration was down here, a faint perfume promising honeyed oblivion. Creeping dread began to coil in his gut. This was worse than a wreck. Wrecks were chaotic, violent. This was ordered. This was a place where people had waited, neatly and quietly, for an end that had simply flowed in and taken them. He keyed his comms, the click loud in the silence. "Moreau, I'm in the main ward. It's intact, unnervingly so." The reply was a burst of static, like frying circuits. "Joric, signals trash down here. Watch your 6. "Copy that," Joric muttered, though he doubted she heard. The signal wouldn't improve.
He was alone. Professionally, this was routine. A simple salvage op in a hazardous environment. Find the portable bioscanner, get out. But his professionalism felt like a thin sheet of pre-deluge glass, ready to spiderweb. He began to move, his mag boots clamping to the tiled floor with soft, metallic thuds. He kept one hand on the wall, a baseline in a world where up and down were becoming abstract concepts. The plan was simple, a systematic grid search, row by row, but the sheer scale of the ward was disorienting. The rows of beds stretched on, vanishing into the green-black gloom beyond his lamp's throw. Then it happened. The light from his headlamp, his only source of clarity in this tomb, flickered. It dimmed to a sickly orange, then flared back to white. "Salt rot," he whispered, the curse absorbed by his rebreather. He tapped the casing, a useless, ingrained habit. "Don't you dare die on me. Not here." The light flickered again, harder this time. White, black, white, black. The ward transformed into a series of terrifying strobe-lit tableaus. In one flash, he saw a medical chart, still clipped to the foot of the bed, its pages swollen into a pulpy mass. In the next, a gurney, its restraint straps waving like kelp. Flash, a shattered window looking out into the absolute black of the bloom deeps. Flash, a trail of bubbles rising from a floor vent, a ghost's last breath.
He was losing his bearings. The perfect, repeating grid of beds became a disorienting maze in the strobing light. Had he passed this row already? Was that the same diagnostics cart or a different one? The faint bioluminescence of fungal spores on the far walls did nothing to help. It only painted the darkness with shifting, untrustworthy patterns, shapes that looked like faces, like reaching hands. His heart rate spiked, a frantic drum against his ribs. He fought to control his breathing, the rasp of the rebreather suddenly deafening. Wasted air was wasted time was death. He pressed the comm unit again, a desperate, foolish gesture. "Morrow, talk to me. Give me a sit representative. Anything." Static answered, a long, tearing sound like canvas ripping. Then, for a heart-stopping second, a voice. Not Morrow's, a child's voice, faint and distorted, humming a lullaby he hadn't heard in 30 years, his daughter's lullaby. No, not now, not here. It was the spores. He knew it was. A mild psychoactive contamination, working its way through his suit's compromised filters. It was a symptom, a biological process. But knowing the science didn't stop the cold fist of panic from closing around his throat. The humming was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the hiss of the void. The comm was dead, truly dead. The headlamp chose that moment to give up entirely. It sputtered one last pathetic orange glow and then plunged him into darkness. Panic, raw and overwhelming, seized him. He was blind. He was lost in a sunken maze, 100 meters below the nearest pocket of breathable air. The groans of the city's superstructure, the heartbeat he'd known his whole life, were absent here. There was only the immense, crushing pressure of the water and the soft clink-clink of a loose bed frame tapping against an IV pole somewhere in the black. Every small sound was magnified, twisted into a threat. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again, forcing them to adjust. The ghostly green of the murmuration's bloom provided the barest outline of his surroundings. The floating beds were now just hulking, rectangular voids in the gloom. The skeletal IV stands were claws reaching for him. The scale of the task of finding one small device in this mausoleum. It was impossible. Suicidal. Abort the mission. That was the protocol. When equipment fails and communication is lost, you abort.
He could retrace his steps. The wall. He still had the wall. He could follow it back to the door, back to the corridor, back to Morrow's winch line. He could leave the scanner, leave this whole salt-rotted plan to fester in the deep. His hand, trembling, found the cold, slimy tile of the wall. This was it. He was done. Let Kaolin find some other fool to send into the abyss. He took one step, then another, his mag boots heavy, leaden with failure. Then a flicker. A single defiant spark from his headlamp. It wasn't the brilliant white from before, but a weak, tea-colored beam, unsteady, but there. It lasted for a second, 2, 3, long enough. It didn't illuminate the whole ward, but it cut through the darkness directly in front of him, across the chasm of the central aisle. And there it was. Not the scanner, something better. A destination. It was a set of reinforced double doors, different from the others. A faded, peeling biohazard trefoil was still visible on its surface, and below it, stenciled letters made stark by the failing light. Diagnostic Imaging, Level 3, Biocontainment. The light died again, returning him to the green-tinged black. But it didn't matter. The panic was gone, burned away by a sudden, terrible clarity. He had a target. He had a path. "Okay, Cantor," he breathed into the silence of his helmet. "Stay dry." He let go of the wall and pushed off into the center of the sunken ward. The groan was the worst part, not the sudden, shrieking tear of metal giving way somewhere in the floors below, but the long, resonant complaint of support beams that followed. It was the sound of benthos dying, a low-frequency hum that vibrated up through the soles of Joric's boots and settled in his teeth. Water, thick with the sickly sweet scent of fungal bloom, lapped at a collapsed gurney, its single intact wheel spinning with a lazy, rhythmic squeak. Dead end. Salt rot. The corridor ahead was an impassable knot of shattered polymer plating, twisted conduits, and fallen ductwork. A thick cable, severed and alive, spat a shower of orange sparks into a pool of brackish water, the sizzle a sharp counterpoint to the constant, metronomic drip from the ceiling. He had dragged Alara through 2 sublevels of the derelict infirmary, following what he thought was a viable egress route on his wrist interface's schematic. But the schematic was a pre-deluge lie. It didn't account for 82 years of decay, pressure, and the city's slow, inevitable surrender. He checked the interface again. The water pressure sensor for this sector was a frantic, blinking red. Rising, always rising. The kidney had reversed, and now it was force-feeding the city its own polluted, spore-choked lifeblood. A citywide drowning. "We have to go back," he murmured, the words tasting like failure. He didn't look at Alara, couldn't bear to see the impassive trust in her wide eyes. She stood a few feet away, a small, still figure in the greasy green glow of the mycelium that spiderwebbed across the walls, her silence a heavier burden than any accusation. Turning back meant navigating the flooded ward they'd just escaped, where the ceiling had begun to sag under the weight of the water above. It meant facing the long submerged section of maintenance tunnel he'd gambled on bypassing. It was a death sentence, just a slower one. A more logical one. And Joric Cantor was, if nothing else, a logical man. His light flickered, the beam of his headlamp stuttering. He topped the casing, a useless, reflexive gesture. The battery was dying. Everything was dying. That was when he saw her. She wasn't a shimmer this time, not a fleeting after-image at the edge of his vision. She stood just before the tangled wreckage, as solid and real as the rusting metal around her. Leah. His Leah. Not as a 7-year-old, but as he last saw her, 10, all sharp angles and missing a front tooth, her hair in 2 messy braids just like her mother used to make. She wore the blue jumper he'd bought her for her last birthday, the one now buried under a kilometer of toxic silt and 80 years of memory. Joric's breath hitched. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "No," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the gurgle of a nearby drain. "You're not real."
This was the sickness, the whispering sickness. He knew the pathology. Stage 1, auditory hallucinations, the hymns. Stage 2, minor visual distortions. Stage 3, full sensory integration. The murmuration wasn't just in the air he breathed. It was in his blood, his synapses, hijacking the grief-scarred pathways of his brain to build its puppets. It was using his own pain as a weapon against him. A pathogen, nothing more. A complex, insidious pathogen. He squeezed his eyes shut, knuckles white as he pressed them against his eyelids. Count the pumps. Listen to the heartbeat. Ground yourself. 1, 2, 3. The deep thudding rhythm of the city's main circulatory system was gone, replaced by the chaotic roar of the flood. There was no anchor left. When he opened his eyes, she was still there. The green bioluminescence of the corridor seemed to cling to her, giving her form a soft, ethereal outline, but her face was perfectly clear. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't speaking. She just looked at him with a profound, heartbreaking calm. Then slowly she raised her small hand. She pointed, not back the way they came, not at any visible door or opening. She pointed directly at the most impassable section of the collapsed corridor, the place where a massive slab of pre-stressed concrete had fallen, pinning a web of rebar and ventilation shafts into a solid wall of debris. A tomb. Joric laughed, a dry, rasping sound scraped from the back of his throat. Right, of course. The fungus wanted him dead. It wanted him to walk into the wreckage and be crushed, to give up and let the mycelial threads cocoon his body, to add his biomass to the collective. It was the most logical explanation. He turned away from the apparition, his back to the ghost of his daughter. "Ilara, we're leaving." He took a step, but a sound stopped him. A deep, fracturing crack from the ceiling behind them, the direction of their retreat. A fresh torrent of water, black and churning, poured down, instantly deepening the pool at their feet. The way back was gone. Not just dangerous, gone. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. His carefully constructed wall of logic crumbled into dust. They were trapped, boxed in, left to drown in the dark, while a phantom baited him toward a pile of rubble. The air grew thick, heavy with the ozone tang of the sparking cable and the cloying honey and rot perfume of the murmuration. He was going to die here. She was going to die here. He turned back. Leah hadn't moved. Her arm was still extended, her small finger pointing with unwavering certainty. Her expression hadn't changed. It was one of patience, of knowing. It was the same look she'd given him once when he couldn't solve one of her ridiculous riddles. His scientific rationalism felt like a prayer to a dead god. What had it given him? A life of sterile certainty in a world of meaningless suffering? It had allowed him to catalog the pathologies of faith while his own soul rotted from the inside out. Now it offered him one final, logical truth. There is no escape. But the ghost, the symptom, the pathogen,
It was offering something else. A lie, certainly. A trick. But it was an option beyond the inevitable. A choice. Joric looked from the impossible path to the hallucination of his daughter. He thought of her trust, the absolute unthinking faith a child places in a parent, the faith he had lost, twice over, first in God, then in himself. "It's a trick," he said to the empty, dripping air. "It's just the spores." But what if it wasn't? The question was a poisoned dart to the heart of his entire existence. What if, in some way he couldn't quantify or analyze, it was real? What if this thing he was fighting wasn't just a mindless fungus, but something that held remnants, memories? He looked at Alar, who was watching him, her gaze fixed on his face, not the space where Leah stood. She was waiting for him to save her, and his logic had failed. He took a deep breath, the damp, spore-thick air filling his lungs. He made the choice. He chose the lie. He chose the sickness. He chose hope, the most dangerous pathogen of all. "All right," he whispered, the word a surrender, a prayer. "All right, Leah, I see." He took Ilara's small, cold hand in his, her fingers curled around his, a fragile anchor in the storm of his unraveling sanity. He walked toward the wall of debris, his eyes fixed on the spot where the ghost of his daughter pointed. He didn't look at her anymore, afraid she might vanish, afraid that the fragile thread of this new, terrifying faith might snap. As he drew closer, his headlamp beam, now fading to a pathetic orange glow, caught it. It wasn't an open path. It was something his panicked mind had dismissed in a fraction of a second. A gap. Beneath the massive concrete slab, where a twisted support pillar had created a small triangular cavity, there was a space. It was barely wide enough to crawl through, a jagged hole lined with sharp edges of sheared metal and broken polymer. It would be a tight, dangerous squeeze, but it was a way through. The ghost's compass had pointed true. Without a backward glance, Joric knelt, pushing aside a piece of loose rubble. "Stay right behind me," he said to Ilara, his voice strained. "Don't let go." He slid into the darkness, the rough concrete scraping his back. He had crossed a line far more significant than the one between two collapsing corridors. He was actively collaborating with his own infection, navigating by the phantoms it generated. He was following the sickness deeper into the heart of the city, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the rising water, that he would never find his way back. The passage was a throat, and Joric was the bitter pill it was trying to swallow. Grime-caked plascrete scraped his shoulders, the sound of it a dry tearing against his soaked jacket. Every inch was a fight. Ilara was strapped to his back, a dead weight of trust he didn't deserve, her shallow breaths ghosting against his neck. Ahead, the only reason he hadn't given up and let the rising water take him was the light. Not a light. Her. Leah. She flickered, a child-sized silhouette woven from the same sickly green-blue bioluminescence that coated the bloom deeps. A hallucination, a symptom, the ghost note in the salt-stained hymnal of his own decay. She didn't walk, she drifted, her bare feet hovering inches above the slick, corroded floor plate. She looked back at him, her face a perfect, heartbreaking reconstruction from a past that felt more alien than this submerged hell. Her expression held no fear, only a patient, placid encouragement. The spores weren't just showing him his daughter. They were puppeteering his grief.
"Just a little farther, Daddy," her voice echoed, not through the air, but directly inside his skull. A clean, perfect sound in a world of drip and groan. He grunted, shoving himself forward with one hand while the other clutched the precious satchel, containing Elara's blood samples and the jury-rigged synthesizer. The water sloshing around his knees was cold, thick with a slurry of filth and mycelial threads that clung to his legs like grasping fingers. The smell was suffocating, the ozone tang of failing circuitry, the wet dog stench of old insulation, and beneath it all, the sweet, fungal perfume of the murmuration. Honey and rot, the scent of his own unraveling. Leah's form shimmered through a web of hanging cables that drooped from a ruptured conduit like severed veins. They spat tiny, aggressive blue sparks into the gloom. Joric froze, his own light picking out the frayed, exposed copper. One wrong move, one brush against the metal housing while standing in knee-deep water. Salt rot. A stupid way to end it. He looked at the ghost. It had passed through the hazard without a flicker of disruption. Of course it had. It wasn't real. It's not real, he told himself, the mantra of the sane man losing his war. It's a projection. The fungus is in my optic nerve, my auditory cortex. It's hijacking memory and sensory input to create a guide, a lure. But a lure to where? Safety? Or the heart of the growth? He gritted his teeth, the sound loud in his ears. Carefully, painstakingly, he threaded his body through the nest of wires, his muscles screaming from the contorted posture. A spark jumped to a nearby metal strut with a sharp crack, and he flinched violently, banging his head against the low ceiling. A small shower of rust and grit rained down. Elara stirred on his back, whimpering in her sleep. "Shh, shh, stay dry, little one," he murmured, the meaningless platitude tasting like ash in his mouth. He made it through. He looked up, his breath coming in ragged pants. Leah was waiting for him 10 meters ahead, standing at the edge of a slightly wider section of the service tunnel. Here the groan of Benthos was louder, a deep, resonant agony that vibrated up through the soles of his boots. A massive support beam, thick as his body, sagged ominously from the ceiling, a spider web of fractures covering its surface. Plasticrete dust drifted from the cracks like spectral snow. It was a deadfall waiting to happen. The entire structural integrity of this section rested on that one decaying pillar. His every instinct, every lesson learned in the drowned cradle, screamed of him to move. Get past it now. Don't hesitate. Don't breathe. Just run before the city's bones give way completely. He took a step, preparing to scramble. But Leah didn't move. She simply stood there, just before the failing beam, and raised a single luminous hand, a gesture to stop. Joric froze mid-stride, confusion warring with primal fear. "Leah, we have to go, now." The words were a choked plea. He was talking to a phantom, begging a symptom for permission to survive. The image of his daughter turned its head. The placid, gentle smile remained. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. She just shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. Wait. What? No. Salt rot. It's going to collapse. The voice of reason in his head was shrieking. It's the fungus. It's trying to get you killed. It's tricking you. He could feel the vibrations worsening, the deep hum of decay intensifying. Another shower of dust cascaded from the fractured beam. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He took another half step, defying the vision.
Ilara's life depended on him. His life depended on him. He couldn't die here because a ghost told him to wait.
But his legs wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, caught between instinct and the absolute irrational authority in that small, glowing face, the face of his daughter. The part of him that had died with her 82 years ago was still in command, and it trusted her completely.
He felt a tremor of something that was almost laughter, a bubble of pure madness rising in his throat. He was being led through hell by a ghost that knew the way because it was the devil itself. Slowly, shakily, Joric began to climb over the sharp-edged rubble. His movements were different now. He was no longer a man fleeing a monster. He was a scientist following the data, no matter how insane the conclusion. He looked at the shimmering girl waiting for him, her light a beacon in the suffocating dark. "Okay," he breathed, the word a plume of vapor in the cold air. "Okay, Leah, show me the way." The air in the infirmary's biostorage was thick enough to drink, a cocktail of ozone from a dying power conduit and the sweet fungal rot that was benthos's perfume. Each drip of condensation from the ceiling struck the rusted metal shelves with the hollow finality of a funeral bell. Joric's breath plumed in the cold, a ghost of a ghost in the narrow beam of his hand lamp. The light slid across rows of identical salt-pitted lockers, each a sealed tomb of forgotten medicine and failed hopes. He was not alone. She stood by the far wall, a small silhouette that drank the darkness. Leah. Her form was perfect, right down to the little frayed ribbon on the collar of her tunic, a detail his memory had polished to a diamond-sharp edge. She was 7 years old forever, a hallucination, a symptom, and his only guide. "Just tell me again," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. I'm not sure I see it." The apparition of his daughter didn't speak. She never did. She simply raised a small luminous hand and pointed, her gesture unwavering, at a locker 3 rows down, 4 units from the floor. It looked no different from the rest, a canvas of corrosion and decay. He'd been at this for an hour, his hope eroding with every screech of a pried-open door, revealing nothing but desiccated synth skin and shattered vials. His tools were gone, lost in the raid on Thorne's lab. All he had left was a pry bar, his conviction, and the ghost the fungus had grown in his head. The city groaned around him, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the soles of his boots, the death rattle of the Gill-Racks as the floodwaters did their work.
He squeezed his eyes shut. Logic, Joric. Structured survivalism. The BCA mantra was a useless prayer now. Logic dictated that this was a random firing of infected neurons. The murmuration was a pathogen, and this was the fever dream of a dying man. His mind was projecting a pattern onto chaos. There was no intelligence here, no guidance, just sickness. "Salt rot," he spat, the sound dead in the damp. He ignored her pointing finger and moved to the locker next to it. He wedged the pry bar into the seam and threw his weight against it. The metal screamed. It popped open with a gout of stale air and the clatter of something glass. He shined his light inside. A box of pre-deluge ampules, every single one cracked, their contents long evaporated. He slammed the door shut. The apparition of Leah had not moved. Her hand was still extended, patient, ethereal. His heart ached with a familiar, crushing weight. It was easier to believe she was a ghost than a trick of the light. Easier to believe in a spirit than in the alien puppetry of a mold. "Fine," he conceded to the silence.
Fine. Your way. He moved to the locker she indicated, his movements heavy with self-loathing. He felt like a primitive man bowing to an eclipse. This was a betrayal of everything he was, everything he had rebuilt himself to be after the deluge had taken the real Leah from him. He was a debunker, a destroyer of false gods, and here he was taking directions from one. He set the pry bar. The rust was thicker here, fused like a weld. He grunted, muscles straining, the damp chill of the room doing nothing to cool the sweat beading on his forehead. The metal shrieked in protest, a high, piercing sound that made the teeth in his skull vibrate. It gave. With a final, groaning pop, the door swung inward. Joric held his breath. He swept the beam of his lamp inside. There, nestled on a bed of yellowed, sterile foam, was the bioscanner. A Model 7 Omni-Field Analyzer, pre-deluge. Its casing was dull polymer, its screen dark, but it was intact. Perfect. The one piece of equipment he needed. The one thing that could give him a fighting chance to synthesize a counteragent from Ellara's blood. The key to everything.
A choked sound escaped his throat. It might have been a laugh. He reached in, his hand trembling, and lifted the device. It felt solid, real, a tangible piece of a logical world he thought he had lost forever. The weight of it was the most beautiful thing he had ever felt. Victory. Cold and clear and undeniable. He had it. "Leah!" he breathed. Turning back, the scanner clutched to his chest like a holy text. "You did it! You actually—" He stopped. The words died in his throat. She stood in the same spot, offering him a gentle, beatific smile. It was her smile. He knew it better than his own reflection. But something was wrong, profoundly wrong. The air around her shimmered, not like a memory, but like the greasy film on polluted water. Her edges blurred, the crisp lines of her form wavering as if seen through intense heat. For a fraction of a second, her face, it distorted. Her chin became too sharp, her forehead too high, an alien geometry hiding beneath a familiar mask. And her eyes, her warm brown eyes, the ones that held the memory of every bedtime story and every scraped knee, flickered. They dissolved, replaced by a swirling internal light, a sick, greasy blue-green. The exact same bioluminescence as the fungal veins that crept along the joins of the walls, pulsing with a slow, non-human rhythm. It wasn't reflected light, it was a light from within. Cold, ancient, utterly without love. His blood turned to ice water. The triumphant warmth of a moment ago vanished, leaving a cold so deep it felt like it was freezing his soul from the inside out. This was not his daughter. This was not his grief. This was not a random symptom. This was it, the murmuration, the consciousness, and it was looking at him. It was wearing his daughter's face like a stolen coat, and it was smiling at him with her mouth after leading him to the one weapon that might destroy it. The bioscanner in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, its purpose uncertain. Was it a tool he had found, or a gift he had been given? Just as quickly as it had appeared, the distortion vanished. She was Leah again. Perfect, innocent, her smile unwavering, her brown eyes filled with an impossible, silent love.
But he had seen it. He couldn't unsee it. The prize in his hands now felt like bait. He stared at the apparition, then down at the scanner, a knot of pure existential terror tightening in his gut. He wasn't just losing his mind, he was being led by the enemy. The air inside the basilisk was a lie. It was clean, dry and cold, tasting of ozone from the overworked scrubbers and the faint hot metal tang of the vehicle's power core. Outside, beyond the armor-plast shell, the Gill-Racks wept and rotted. Inside, there was only the low-frequency hum of silent, functioning technology and the crisp blue-white light of tactical displays. A pocket of the Eyrie set down in hell. Unit Leader Varus stood before the holographic map table, hands clasped behind his back. The map was a three-dimensional nightmare of decaying superstructure, a lattice of walkways and service tunnels rendered in skeletal green lines. Red icons pulsed slowly, marking known spore-heavy zones. Amber icons flickered where structural integrity was questionable. It was a cartographer's rendering of a city's dying gasp. His team sat at their stations along the vehicle's interior walls, encased in the same matte black purity armor he wore. They were silent, disciplined statues, waiting. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic tapping of Signals Tech Ryla at her console. "Anything, Tech?" Varus asked, his voice flat, filtered through his helmet's internal comm. "Still running the trace algorithm, sir." Ryla's reply was equally sterile, but a thread of youthful tension ran beneath it. "His slate is either off, destroyed, or too deep for a passive ping. The network chatter down here is a salt-rot massive ghosts, old signals echoing off the metal." Varus didn't respond. He simply watched the map, his mind tracing the probable paths of a desperate man. Joric Cantor, a former asset, a heretic by association, now a fugitive. Commander Rask's orders had been unequivocal. Contain the target, secure the asset, the immune child, and neutralize any and all sump-tainted affiliated. Contain, a clean clinical word for a dirty, wet job. He thought of the reports, the miracle at the cistern, the riots, the whispers of Silas's growing influence. It was like trying to cup water in your hands. For every leak you plugged, another sprang from between your fingers. And Cantor was now splashing in the deepest, dirtiest part of the puddle. A sharp electronic chirp cut through the hum. Ryla stiffened. "Sir, I have something." Varus was at her side in 2 silent strides, his shadow falling over her console. "Report." "It's not a live ping," she said, her fingers flying across the touch-sensitive surface, isolating data streams. "It's a ghost, a data wake, from 3 hours ago. Cantor accessed a public terminal. He used his old BCA credentials to fool. Must have been a reflex." Varus leaned closer, his helmet's faceplate nearly touching the screen. The log was there, a user ID he recognized, Joric K, time-stamped, geotagged, and a data request query. "Schematics," Varus murmured, the vocoder stripping all inflection from the word. "Level 4 infirmary, Gamma 9 district, the one that was decommissioned after the pump failure." "He was looking for medical supplies, sir," Ryla added, stating the obvious. "Or equipment." "He's wounded," Varus corrected her softly. "Or the girl is. Or the sump diver." He straightened up, turning back to the main holo table. "Ryla, patch that terminal's location to the main display." "Aye, sir." A new icon blinked into existence on the skeletal map, a bright, insistent cyan. It was deep in a residential block, a place of collapsed walkways and perpetual rain from the upper levels. A rat's nest. Vera stared at it. His gauntleted finger hovered over the glowing point, then began to trace paths outward, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't thinking like a soldier anymore. He was thinking like a hunter, like the prey. You're hurt. You need supplies. You have a child with you and a guide who knows these tunnels. You risk a public terminal because you are desperate. After that, you don't stay in the open. You go to ground. But not just anywhere. You go somewhere defensible, somewhere with resources, somewhere known to your guide. His finger stopped, circling a section of industrial sublevels a dozen grids away from the terminal. It was a confluence of maintenance tunnels, old sewer lines, and a massive, semi-operational reclamation pump. Cross-reference that terminal's location with known sump-tainted dens and black market nexes, he ordered. The map shifted. A rash of smaller, dimmer icons appeared. None were a perfect match. They were too transient, too exposed.
Now, Varus said, his voice dropping slightly. Cross-reference it with registered maintenance personnel from the last 5 years. Filter for sump divers, known associates. The system churned for a moment. Most of the new icons vanished. One remained, pulsing steadily right where his finger had stopped. It was tagged to a work log entry for emergency repairs. Morocade, sump diver, formerly contracted pump maintenance. There, Varus said. It wasn't a triumphant declaration, merely a statement of fact. Pump Station Epsilon 7. It's her territory. Power, defensible access points, a direct route into the Bloom Deeps if they need to run. He looked up from the map, his blank faceplate sweeping over his waiting team. She'd take him there. He tapped a series of commands onto the table's edge. The map zoomed in, highlighting the station in crimson. Ingress and egress routes flashed in orange. Helmets on, seal checks. His voice regained its sharp command line authority. Comms channel is secure. We are weapons hot on my mark. The hiss of armor seals locking echoed in the confined space. The soft glow of the displays reflected off 12 identical, unblinking faceplates. Alpha Team, Varus said, his gaze fixed on the holomap. You will establish a perimeter at these access points. 3 junctions on the map lit up. Hard seal, nothing gets in or out. No exceptions. Acknowledge. A chorus of 2-toned clicks answered from his team's comms. Bravo, you're with me. Primary ingress through Service Conduit 82. Silent entry. We move on my signal. Standard pincer formation once we're inside. He paused, letting the orders sink in. Rules of engagement are as follows. The sump diver is expendable. Cantor is to be disabled, not killed. Rask wants to make an example of him. He made a final gesture on the map, highlighting the central pump chamber. The child, Ilara, is the priority asset. I want her alive and unharmed. Use suppressors and shock rounds only. If you get a clean shot at the girl with a tranquilizer dart, you take it. Is that understood? Another series of clicks, the disciplined sound of professionals acknowledging a task. Good. Varus turned from the table and strode towards the vehicle's rear assault ramp. They've had 3 hours. They're comfortable. They think they're safe. We will prove them wrong. He hit the release stud.
With a loud hiss of depressurizing hydraulics, the heavy ramp began to lower. The lie of the basilisk's clean air was broken instantly. A wall of smell and sound crashed into the sterile interior. The sweet, cloying reek of fungal rot and wet metal, the pervasive dampness that clung to everything, the distant groaning sigh of benthos shifting in its slow-motion collapse. The perpetual twilight of the Gill-Racks revealed a dripping, rusted world of catwalks and shadows. Varus stepped out onto the ramp, his mag boots clanking on the grated metal. The drizzle began to bead on his armor. He raised his pulse rifle, its tactical light cutting a brilliant white spear through the smog. Behind him, his team disembarked, their movements fluid and silent, fanning out into the oppressive gloom. They were ghosts of order in a world of chaos. The net had been cast. Now they were pulling it closed. The shaft was a vertical coffin of rusted iron and weeping concrete. Rung after rusted rung, he pulled himself upward, his movements clumsy against the water's resistance. The muscles in his back and shoulders, already strained from the descent, began to burn with a low, acidic fire. One rung, then another. The rhythmic hiss of his rebreather was a fragile sound against the city's true pulse, the deep, tectonic groan of stressed superstructures, a sound that vibrated through the metal rungs and into his very bones. The heartbeat of benthos, the endless groaning work of the pumps, keeping this whole salt-rotted tomb from final collapse. He counted the rungs, a pointless mantra to occupy his mind. 21, 22. The water temperature dropped a degree. A thin, slick film of algae made the iron treacherous under his gloves. He paused, clinging to the ladder, and looked up. The surface was an impossible distance away, a shimmering ceiling he couldn't even see. He was a fly crawling up the inside of a well. Down was a grave. Up was merely a reprieve. That was when the hum changed. The deep, metronomic thrum of the city's pumps faltered. For a single terrifying beat, it stopped, and in the sudden silence, a new sound emerged, a high-frequency whine that drilled directly into his skull. He looked down, tracing the source. A thick, armored conduit pipe, running parallel to the shaft 20 feet below, was glowing. Not with the organic light of the murmuration, but with the angry industrial orange of metal strained to its breaking point. A hairline fracture spider-webbed across its surface, a failing seam. Salt rot. He had no time to react. The thought barely formed before the world dissolved into violence. The pipe didn't burst, it detonated. A horizontal spear of high-pressure, silt-choked water erupted from the fracture, slamming into the maintenance shaft with the force of a solid object. The impact threw Joric across the chasm, smashing him against the opposite wall. The air in his lungs vanished in a percussive blast of bubbles, his rebreather torn from his mouth by the sheer violence of the current. Panic, pure and incandescent, overrode every shred of his training. The roar was absolute, a physical presence that crushed him, deafened him, and scoured him with sand and rust. His grip on the ladder was gone. He was tumbling, helpless, in a liquid chaos.
His vision narrowed to a tunnel of churning darkness and fading green light. Drowning wasn't the gentle fade of hypoxia he'd read about in med texts. It was a frantic, clawing agony, a fire in the chest demanding air that wasn't there. His fingers scrabbled against the slimy concrete, finding nothing. The current was trying to peel him apart, to force him back down into the depths he had just escaped. Then the pressure changed. The direct force of the torrent lessened,
deflected by something new in the water. Through the blooming black spots in his vision, he saw a shape rising from the blackness below, caught in the violent vortex. It was a body, pale and strangely graceful in its slow, chaotic tumble. A bloomed. It drifted closer, its limbs lax, its head lolling on its neck. It was a woman, maybe 30, her old-world work fatigues now a second skin of gray and pulsating fungal lace. Her face, turned toward him by the current, was framed by tendrils of glowing mycelium that wove through her hair like a crown, and her expression was serene. In the heart of this roaring, killing chaos, her face was a mask of perfect, untroubled peace. Her eyes, filmed over with a milky, bioluminescent membrane, were open and placid. She was beautiful. The thought was an intrusion, alien and horrifying. As Joric fought the last vestiges of his consciousness, a screaming animal desperate for a single breath, this corpse angel floated in its own private heaven. The current pushed her closer still. Her outstretched hand, fingers trailing delicate filaments of light, brushed against his cheek. The touch was not cold or rigid, but soft, yielding. For a sickening, eternal second, locked in that gentle caress, he saw his own reflection warped in the surface of her glowing eye, a mask of bulging-eyed terror, mouth wide in a silent scream. The meaningless suffering he championed, mirrored in the eye of blissful servitude. Revulsion was a galvanic shock. It gave him strength he didn't know he had. With a final, explosive effort, he kicked. His boot connected with the bloomed soft torso. He used its placid, buoyant body as a launching point, pushing himself away, out of the direct path of the roaring water, and away from that horrifying peace. He scrambled upward, no longer climbing, but clawing, hand over hand, rung over rung, fueled by a primal terror that went deeper than the fear of death. It was the fear of that serenity, of that vacant, beautiful salvation. He didn't stop, didn't look back. He could feel the bloom's passive gaze on his back, a silent invitation to let go, to join the hymn. His fingers broke the surface. Air. He gasped, a raw, ragged sound, and hauled his upper body onto a narrow, grated service ledge, slick with condensation. He collapsed, coughing, retching foul, gritty water onto the iron grill. His throat burned. His lungs were on fire. For minutes he could do nothing but lie there, shivering uncontrollably, listening to the roar of the ruptured pipe below and the shuddering groan of a dying city all around him. The scanner, its casing cracked, was still clipped to his belt. He had his prize. He was alive. But the image of that serene face in the watery chaos was burned onto the back of his eyelids. A perfect, peaceful God in a hell of Joric's own making. The surface of the access pool broke not with a swimmer's grace, but with the frantic, tearing eruption of a drowning man. Joric Cantor clawed his way out of the scummy water, fingers slipping on the rust-scaled rungs of the ladder. He heaved himself over the edge, collapsing onto the grated metal deck in a shuddering heap. The water that streamed from his utility suit wasn't just water. It was a slurry of filth and memory, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of the bloom deeps. For a moment, all he could do was lie there, cheek pressed against the cold, vibrating floor, listening to the city's deep, metronomic heartbeat, the thrum of the distant pumps. His lungs were on fire. Each breath was a ragged, liquid-filled gasp that did little to oxygenate the screaming tissues. The vision still clung to the ragged edges of his sight, like afterimages burned onto his retinas. His daughter, Lily, not as a memory, but as a shimmering bioluminescent guide, her small hand pointing the way through a submerged conduit choked with mycelial threads. Her voice, a perfect echo in the silent, crushing depths, whispering encouragement. "Almost there, Daddy. Stay dry. Salt rot." Even his ghosts were learning the local slang. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, the motion sending a wave of nausea through him. A figure stood in the greasy orange light of the workshop, motionless. Moro Cade. She hadn't moved to help. She hadn't offered a word. She just watched, arms crossed over the chest of her patched rebreather harness, her face an unreadable mask of shadows and scars. Her stillness was more unnerving than any threat. It was the patience of a predator or a scavenger waiting for the dying to be done. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, Joric fumbled at his belt. His fingers, numb and clumsy, found the bioscanner. He unclipped it, the device heavy and solid in his trembling hand. He didn't have the strength to stand, didn't have the air to speak. He crawled the last meter and shoved the scanner across the deck. It slid on a foam of grime and pool water, stopping with a sharp metallic clatter at her booted feet. The small indicator light on its casing pulsed with a steady, serene green. Data acquired. Mission complete. Payment rendered. That was all he had left. The effort shattered the last of his composure. A cough ripped through him, a deep, foundational tremor that started in his gut and tore its way up his throat. He doubled over, spitting a thick, brackish fluid onto the grate. It was tinged with something darker than blood, shimmering faintly with the same sickly luminescence he'd seen coating the walls of the cistern. He was contaminated. He knew it. The price wasn't just exhaustion, it was a piece of his own cellular sovereignty. He coughed again, the sound wet and ugly in the relative quiet of the workshop, each spasm a fresh agony. Through watering eyes he watched Moro. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the scanner. After a long moment, she bent down, not with her knees, but in a fluid, economical hinge from the waist, and picked it up. Her movements were spare, efficient, devoid of any wasted energy. This was her world, the vertical, waterlogged hell of Benthos, where gravity and pressure were the only gods that mattered, and survival was a currency earned through brutal calculus. She turned the device over in her gloved hands. Her workshop was a testament to that same calculus. Racks of salvaged regulators and scrubber components lined one wall, meticulously cleaned and catalogued. Coils of high-pressure tubing hung like sleeping serpents. On a workbench, the dissected carcass of a BCA patrol drone lay under the focused beam of a task light, its delicate circuitry exposed like the organs of a sacrificial animal. The air smelled of ozone, conductive grease, and the perpetual damp rot of the Gill-Racks, an incense of decay and desperate maintenance. Joric's breathing began to steady, graduating from raw gasps to shuddering inhalations. He watched her thumb move across the scanner's small, pressure-sealed screen, activating it. The screen flared to life, casting a pale blue light onto her face, illuminating the hard lines around her mouth, the web of scars at her temple. She cycled through the data streams, spore density readings, spectral analysis of the mycelial mass, gravimetric resonance logs from the core sample. Joric had gone deeper than they'd agreed, risked more. He'd followed the whispers, the ghost of his little girl, into a pocket of the network that felt older, more potent. He'd mapped the very heart of the Gamma-9 bloom. He saw it then. It was a flicker, so small he might have imagined it if he hadn't been staring so intently. A slight, almost imperceptible widening of her eyes. The hard set of her jaw softened for a fraction of a second. It wasn't wonder, it wasn't awe. It was the professional respect of a master craftsperson seeing a piece of impossible work done right. She had sent him on a fool's errand, a test to see if the airy academic had any grit. She expected him to fail, to come back with partial readings and excuses, if he came back at all. She did not expect this. She did not expect him to bring her the God's own fucking signature. She powered down the screen. The workshop plunged back into its familiar orange gloom. She clipped the scanner to her own belt, a gesture of acceptance, of ownership. The transaction was complete. Her eyes finally met his. They were dark, pragmatic, the eyes of a woman who had seen things in the abyssal depths that would have shattered a lesser mind. There was no pity in them, but the contempt that had been there before, the easy disdain for the topside pure slumming it, was gone, replaced by something level, something solid.
"Salt rot," she said, her voice a low rasp, dry as rust. "You actually did it." Joric tried to answer, but all that came out was another weak, bubbling cough. He gave a jerky nod, his entire body aching. She stared at him for another second, her head tilted in assessment. He felt like a piece of equipment she was evaluating for a deep dive, checking the seals, looking for stress fractures. "You've paid the price, theologian." The title was still there, but it sounded different now. Less like an insult, more like a simple, factual descriptor, like diver or mechanic. She turned away from him, moving towards a heavy storage locker. The metal door groaned open. "Pack your things," she called over her shoulder, her voice flat, final. "Whatever you can carry. We go down at first light." The med gel was a lie. It sealed the gash along his forearm, a jagged tear from a ricocheting rivet in Thorne's lab, but it did nothing for the fire beneath. It felt hot and tight, the skin around the translucent film already an angry, inflamed red. Joric worked with a practiced, detached focus, cleaning the wound with a rag soaked in reclaimed water that still smelled faintly of salt and chemicals. Each dab sent a fresh spike of pain up his arm, a grounding sensation in the disorienting quiet of Morrow Cade's workshop. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was no immediate threat, no gunfire, no screams, just the rhythmic, metronomic drip of condensation somewhere outside the bulkhead door, and the low-frequency hum of the city's heartbeat, a sound so constant it was almost silence. Morrow's workshop was a pocket of impossible order carved from the Gill-Racks' chaos. Racks of meticulously organized components, salvaged, tweened, and categorized, lined one wall. A workbench was a controlled mess of wiring, diagnostic tools, and the half-disassembled casing of a BCA sensor drone. The air tasted of ozone and hot metal, a clean, sterile scent that almost masked the pervasive dampness of benthos. Almost.
He glanced over at Alara. The girl sat on a stack of insulated power conduits, her small frame dwarfed by the industrial clutter. She was watching him, her gaze unnervingly steady. She held a small, articulated metal figure Morrow had given her, a pre-deluge toy scavenged from some sunken nursery, turning its limbs over and over without a sound. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd escaped Thorne's lab, since they'd seen him fall. Her silence was a weight, a constant, fragile reminder of what he had failed to protect and what he was now bound to. The key. The cure. A little girl who had lost everything. He saw his own daughter in her, just for a second. The way her dark hair fell across her forehead. A ghost image superimposed, a spore dream clinging to the edges of his vision. "Daddy, it hurts." The whisper was so clear, so real. He flinched, his hand trembling. Salt rot. "Easy, Cantor," Morrow's voice cut through the memory. She stood by a large monitoring console, her back to him. Her own armor was scuffed and scorched, but she moved with an unhurried efficiency that radiated competence. "Don't need you passing out. I'm low on coagulants." "I'm fine," Joric lied, tying off the bandage with his good hand. The knot was clumsy. "Thank you for this, Cadet. For everything." "Haven't done anything yet," she replied, her eyes still on the flickering schematics that danced across the main screen. "Just got you out of the fire. The whole damn sector's a charnel house now. Kalen's purity sweeps?" She trailed off, shaking her head. "He's not cleansing the sickness, he's fertilizing it with bodies." Jorik's gut tightened at the name. Kalen Rask. A man who saw humanity as a system to be debugged, with a thermobaric charge if necessary. He was the reason Thorne was dead. He was the reason they were here, fugitives in their own drowning city. A fragile sense of safety had begun to settle over him. The kind of cautious relief a man feels after a long fall he somehow survives. Here, behind Morrow's reinforced walls, with her expertise and her arsenal, they had a chance, a breath, a moment to think, to regroup, to figure out how to turn the key that was Alara into a weapon. The thought soured in his stomach, but what other choice was there?
Then a new sound entered the workshop's symphony of hums and drips. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, insistent chime, a single digital note repeating in a calm, unhurried rhythm. A notification. Morrow didn't react for a full 3 seconds, but Joric, who had spent a career reading the subtle tells of fanatics and liars, saw it. The sudden, rigid stillness in her shoulders, the way her hand, which had been resting on the console's edge, slowly curled into a fist. "What is it?" Joric asked, his voice low. The chiming stopped. Morrow didn't answer. She tapped a series of commands onto the console. A new window expanded, overlaying the schematics. It showed a local proximity scan, a wireframe map of the catwalks and access tunnels for a 100-meter radius around the workshop. 6 points of light bloomed on the screen. They were blood red. They moved with a synchronized predatory grace, converging on the workshop's location from multiple angles. Beside each icon, a string of alphanumeric code pulsed. Encrypted BCA transponders, not the slapdash signals of a standard patrol. These were military-grade signatures, special operations, Kalen's enforcers. The fragile quiet of the room shattered. The hum of the heartbeat suddenly sounded like a death knell. The drip of water was a countdown timer. Joric's breath hitched in his chest, the pain in his arm forgotten, replaced by a surge of ice-cold adrenaline. They had been found. So soon. It wasn't possible. "How?" he whispered, his eyes locked on the closing net. "Your mentor's lab wasn't as isolated as he thought," Morrow said, her voice flat, devoid of any panic. It was the calm of someone who had lived with imminent death as a constant companion. "Or maybe you brought a tracker with you." Joric's mind raced. Kalen must have tagged him somehow during the raid, a microtransponder in his gear, his coat. It didn't matter. The result was the same. He had led them here. He had brought the executioner to the one person who had offered them sanctuary. He looked at Alara, who was now staring at the screen, her expression unreadable. He had failed her again. Morrow turned from the console. Her movements were fluid, economical. She crossed to a large, unassuming maintenance locker in the corner of the room, one Joric had mistaken for spare parts storage. She keyed a code into a nearly invisible keypad beside the handle. With a hiss of depressurizing air, a section of the locker's interior slid back, revealing not tools, but a weapon rack. Pistols, grenades, and resting in the center cradle, a pulse rifle so heavily modified it barely resembled its BCA origins. Its casing was a dull, non-reflective black, scarred with use. An overcharged capacitor unit was bolted near the stock, humming with latent power. She lifted the rifle from its cradle. It looked heavy, but she handled it with an ease that spoke of long familiarity. The sound of her checking the charge pack was a sharp, definitive series of clicks that echoed in the sudden, tense silence. Joric pushed himself to his feet, his own sidearm feeling like a child's toy in comparison. He could hear it now, a faint, rhythmic thudding from above, the sound of mag boots clamping onto the metal superstructure of the Gill-Racks. They weren't running, they were moving in, a deliberate, disciplined advance, sealing the exits. He moved to stand between them and Ilara, a futile, instinctual gesture. Morrow racked the rifle's charging handle. The weapon whined as it powered up, the air around its emitter shimmering with contained energy. She didn't look at Joric, her gaze fixed on the reinforced bulkhead door, as if she could already see the figures gathering on the other side. "Looks like your former employers," she said, her voice a low, grim murmur, laced with the blackest gallows humor. "Came to see you off."